Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
How was the concept of sovereignty thought about in India before the founding of the Indian Republic? Caleb Simmons has a fascinating new book called Devotional Sovereignty, Kingship and Religion in India. And he's here on the podcast to give us some insights from the time of Tipu Sultan and the Wodeyars of Mysore. Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. Caleb Simmons is an associate professor at the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Arizona and specializes in Hinduism and South Asian religions. Caleb, it's a delight to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Anchoring the conversation today with Caleb is author and historian Manu Pillai, whose first book was on the neighboring and contemporary kingdom of Travancore. He's gone on to write quite a few books on several topics from Indian history and is currently pursuing his PhD from King's College London. Manu, welcome to BIC Talks, and I'm excited about your conversation with Caleb today.
Pleasure, and thank you.
And over to you, Manu.
Thanks a lot. Caleb, I must say that, this is a splendid book, Devotional Sovereignty, Kingship and Religion in India. And, when I first picked it up and I thought, and I had ordered it a while ago, as soon as it came out, I think, and I picked it up and I saw that you'd linked both Krishnaraja Wodeyar III as well as Tipu Sultan. And I wondered, what are these two characters doing in one book? Everything else you read about them would suggest that they occupy almost different planets, even though they, of course, ruled one kingdom in different periods. Because everything is viewed from a religious perspective, I was a little startled to see these two characters together. But by the time I finished your book, I realized that they actually did have much in common, much more than we actually recognize and acknowledge. But before we get to that, I want to play a little bit on the title itself, because your title is interesting in its own right. When you say Devotional Sovereignty, I'd like you to break it down for us a little bit, to begin with the idea of sovereignty itself. Because as you repeatedly mention in the book, we have this notion that sovereignty is about biological descent, which perhaps it was in many European countries. But the Indian tradition is a lot more complex. A king is not just a king because he was made or born from a previous royal couple. There are Puranic links, there are temples, there are saints who come in and bestow sovereignty. There are, babies saved from royal houses destroyed by Parashurama during his great massacre of Kshatriya kings. There's all kinds of ways to access that realm of sovereignty. So if you could just tell us a little bit about, the concept of sovereignty in the Indian context, and then we'll move to the devotional.
Thank you. And it's nice to be in conversation with you, Manu. So, whenever I was writing this book, it was actually supposed to be from my dissertation, which looked at a much broader view of the history of the kingdom of Mysore. But as I was looking more deeply into it, I was thinking about this moment in the early colonial period and focusing really trying to work through what's going on in Krishnaraja III or Krishnaraja Wodeyar, his kingship, and what it meant to be a king under colonial rule, which then begged the question, what does it mean to be a sovereign? And so I tried to think about this more broadly. And, in the book, you see sort of some of my deliberations speaking with the late Maharaja of Mysore and thinking about, exactly what it means to be a Maharaj even in the modern time. And it got me to dive a little more deeply into theoretical works about, just the foundation of sovereignty, what it could possibly even mean. And so I, turned to political theorists, Schmidt and Agamben, and I kept returning to this idea of, the state of exception, how you get this ability to break with normative rules. And as I reflected on what's going on during the period of eventually Tipu Sultan and Krishnaraja III, I couldn't help but think that the way that they formulate sovereignty, their domain, tended from the beginning of their reign to the end, each of them tended to become more religious in its articulations, which made me start to think about the relationship between overlordship and rule and exactly how someone even can define sovereignty. And so there was actually a chapter about Indian sovereignty that had to be removed because the book was a little longer than the publisher wanted. But it reflects on this exact question that you've asked, Manu, about what is different about Indian sovereignty from biological succession that we would see in European nations. And I mean, some things are related. Oftentimes there's, sort of the divine election aspect, but happens much more locally. And oftentimes there's, always a religious professional, a swami, or someone who helps confer authority. And usually this is sealed with some sort of devotional relationship between a deity and a king. And it's that transfer of authority through this religious professional and through the divine election of the king that really is how sovereignty becomes framed more broadly in India, to where it's not necessarily that important to be, linked to the previous king, but somehow that you can show your connection with the divine, which can be through biological succession. It could be through adoptive succession, but some way that you can tie your ruling power back to a deity. And now sometimes, and something the book doesn't really go into, this can be a very local situation to where a local deity is connected to a local king, or it can become much more abstracted to the point to where you can have Vijayanagara king associated with the god of Tirupati. So it's a much broader, in my mind, way of conceptualizing the possibilities of sovereignty within India. But for me, and getting back to your original question, with the title, for me, the linchpin always seems to be devotion to a deity. And then this is expressed in different ways. And part of the argument of the book is that as we get into this period of colonial administrative control, this is really when the shift becomes where the only remaining aspects of sovereignty, at least for Krishnaraja III, are in that devotional realm. That this is how all of the sovereignty is articulated, kind of as a spiritual overlordship, not necessarily an administrative.
Fascinating. In fact, this sort of explains why Lord Dalhousie, for example, was so determined to see, from his view at least, that succession to a throne necessarily depended on biological continuity, whereas Indian princes were always surprised that he wouldn't allow adoptions, because as far as they were concerned, adoptions were perfectly legitimate, and their royal status did not necessarily depend on biological descent. Now, and then, the other stories you mentioned of these holy men as well, other than temples, you see this both with Islamic kings and with the Hindu kings. So, for instance, the Vijayanagara rulers have their connection with Vidyaranya, and you have the first Bahmani Sultan with Nizamuddin Aulia, and there are these stories possibly constructed later. But these stories sort of have these holy men sanctify and legitimize these warriors, really, to transform themselves into kings. Now, you've got two primary characters in the book. One is, of course, Tipu Sultan. The other is Krishnaraja. Now, before we get to Krishnaraja, both of them are equally fascinating, and the parallels are amazing. But we'll stick to Tipu to begin with. And, you have this line somewhere where you refer to kings as curators of, genealogy, history, memory. And they're using these elements in different proportions at different times in order to augment their power or to sort of demonstrate or even some would say perform their sovereign position. And with Tipu, you see all of these elements. You refer to a local element, and you see that in Tipu Sultan, where he's very aware of regional religious traditions, regional ideas of kingship. At the same time, he's also linked to a larger idea of kingship, which comes from the broader Islamic world. At the same time, he's also breaking down what we today imagine to be certain standard notions of religion. So, if you can tell us a little bit about Tipu Sultan's construction of his kingship, his family's background, the way he uses their genealogy, their descent from, Arabia, and then links it to these much more, again, for want of a better word, much more Hindu ideas and local ideas of kingship. That would be great.
This is part of the reason, part of the question that you asked earlier that I didn't really answer was the connection. And I think this is where it really comes in, and where the two characters function as kings and their courts articulate their kingship in similar ways. And part of that, as I looked through the different archives, I began primarily just doing textual studies. But I realized that, in reference to the curation, it's much more than that. These kings and their courts use texts, they use paintings, they use rituals, all to build, or, I tend to think of it in kind of branding their kingship, because, of course, brands are outward projections, which don't necessarily always tell us the whole story, but there's a certain branding that goes on. I think that this is, both outward projection and part of the process of making one a king to oneself. And so Tipu Sultan, there's a lot of things written about him, but his lineage is probably, historically, we don't have much record of it being connected all the way back to the Arabian Peninsula. However, as he starts to solidify his kingship, and as his kingship grows, and then as it eventually diminishes in 1792, there's a turn towards sort of thinking with more longevity about his rule. So at this point, you have, different things being created or produced in the court. You have, actually, he commissions a Kannada text to tell the history of the kings of Mysore. He has commissioned and or helps write things like the Hydernaama, which tells his own lineage. And so there's these parallel tracks to where he sees himself as a continuation of the Vijayanagara kings through the successor state of Mysore. And really, as he tells the story about that genealogy, it's about battle, and you could say like the rights of conquest for a king, that he's able to say, I'm the proper successor because I'm the most militarily capable. On the other hand, in texts like the Hydernaama, he's actually telling the story of his own genealogy and tracing it back to the Arabian Peninsula, to the Prophet Muhammad, and then linking it with his ancestors to different important courts within the Deccan, a lot of the courts that you write about in Rebel Sultans. So you have these two things that seem a little different. One, he's trying to say that he's a military person. The other one's tracing his lineage back. But when you actually look at the writing of like the Hydernaama and the way that it's producing genealogy, and you sort of remove yourself from just sort of looking at it very locally as something that is, a historical document that gives fact, and start thinking about it more of a genre, a genealogical genre within the region, you start to see that this was an articulation of kingship that everyone in the region was doing. For Hindu kings, we have a lot more examples. And instead of tracing themselves back to the Prophet Muhammad, of course, they trace themselves back to a Puranic lineage. Whether it's going to be solar dynasty, lunar dynasty, they find a way. And even in later Mysore records, they trace themselves all the way back to a proper genealogy, back to Mahavishnu giving birth to Brahma out of his navel. So this building of genealogy is, it ties into the idea of biological succession. So you have both ideas there present in the productions of Tipu Sultan, that he is the king by military might, and he's also has the biological background, the ancestry that makes him a viable king. But of course, that is not enough, because there's a lot of people who would be coming from those dynasties. And then this is where the idea of the link with devotion and I'll say religious professional, because it sort of goes beyond just one religious tradition. And Tipu Sultan is very aware that you need that sort of transfer of authority from a deity. So he does it in sort of brilliant ways, to where he ties into, just like he did with the genealogies, ties into the, regional Hindu modes, but then also into the regional Islamic modes. So in this way, he connects himself to the Keladi kingdom, who were another Vijayanagara successor state, and the Vijayanagaras themselves, through his devotion to the Sringeri Jagadguru, in which he had an ongoing, you could call it like a pen pal relationship, but he would write him letters and ask for certain rituals to be done. And a lot of these rituals were the same rituals that Haryambuka had done at the inauguration of the Vijayanagara Empire. And then on the other hand, he was having a hard time, at least locally, with different Muslim families and genealogies. He had a few marriage proposals that were denied. So eventually, the way that he is able to get the transfer of this authority in the Islamic sense is through his dreams. And so he kept a dream journal, which a lot has been written about, especially by Kate Brittlebank. And he's able to actually have these same moments in his dreams. And so he writes about this Muslim Sufi saint, Gisu Daraz, who actually comes and places the turban upon his head, basically having that same moment of coronation that you could have in real life and that we'd seen in the Bijapur context. All this happens. So he's able to have the transfer of authority. He's able to build a genealogy, does all the things he needs to do to sort of have that authorization to be the king and then go forward and do it.
You mentioned, of course, the Keladi connection, which is that they were great patrons of Sringeri. And therefore, when Tipu sort of conquers the area, he inherits a tradition of patronizing Sringeri and then, of course, forges his own bonds. The turban incident is even more interesting, that he had to reconstruct it in his dreams after failing to get a lady from that family. And he had to essentially, he of course claimed that an ancestor had married somebody from that family. But you're right, yeah, he goes ahead and then picks up on that old story, the Kizuzaraz placed his turban on the Sultan's brother in the Deccan, and thereby altered the course of succession, and Tipu sort of lays claim to that again. Which brings me to my next question, especially in the context of Sringeri. You do, in passing, mention how in the final years of Tipu Sultan, between the Third and the Fourth Anglo-Mysore Wars, there is this general notion that even if he was quote-unquote syncretic before, there was this time when he became increasingly jihadist in the final decade of his life, between those two battles, or between those two big wars. And you actually say that, yes, you see the word jihad more, you do see a lot more, jihadist language, if I may, but you actually reframe the whole context. And Sringeri is an important element there, because you've got Tipu Sultan on the one hand telling the Mahaguru that, why don't you perform all these rituals for me, actually sending him Shivalingams, which are, idols, which technically in Orthodox Islam would probably be taboo. And at the same time, when he is talking about jihad, you bring up his correspondence with international figures, including the King of Afghanistan, to show that the jihad is not really framed in religious terms, which I thought was really interesting. If you could tell us a little more about that final phase and the so-called jihadist language that emerges then.
Yeah, no, this is something that, I think you also bring up in your Rebel Sultan's book about, we tend to read everything through our own modern lens of religious identity. And I think a lot of this comes from a lot of sort of Western philosophy and theology making its way across the world to where we, frame our identity oftentimes through communalism. So we think of ourselves as this being a primary identity. And of course, this happened to some extent in pre-modern times, pre-colonial times. Tipu Sultan, without a doubt, was a Muslim. But if you look at the rhetoric that he uses when he writes his letters, we find that he doesn't always frame himself in this way. So when he's writing to, the Afghan king, there's more Islamic language in it. It talks about jihad, talks about infidels. But if we just read that alone, it gives us, we could possibly read into it and say, yes, he is like a fundamentalist Muslim who's out to get all the infidels. But again, it's all about reading things in context. So of course, when he writes to a Muslim king using Persian, he's going to use Persianate terms and frame it in a way that could be read as Islamic fundamentalism. But then if you look beyond that and look to the same period when he's writing letters to the Sringeri Guru, he's writing letters to French commanders, he writes in similar themes, but he doesn't use the same language. When he writes to the Sringeri Guru, he writes about, people who have broken Dharma, and that it's the Kali Yuga, and he needs to be the one that rights these wrongs, and that he, supports the Jagat Guru. And in fact, in certain aspects, in certain letters, he writes and says that, even if God wants me to win, I'm not going to be able to win without your blessings. So it's a pretty bold statement that he's making here that really sort of makes that idea that he's Islamic fundamentalist jihadi start to crumble away very quickly.
And in fact, since you mentioned Sringeri in this particular letter about Dharma, for example, he's actually talking in the context of the Marathas, where the Marathas represent the worst of the Kali Yuga. And it is Tipu, with the blessings of the Sringeri Vishwaguru, who becomes this protector of Dharma. It's just fascinating. It breaks down that whole Hindu-Muslim, binary there.
Yeah, if you actually look at the allies on both sides, at this point, the Marathas are also allied with the Nizam. So there you have a, interreligious alliance. And then you have one on the Mysore side. So, anyone doing, thoroughly contextualized historical work, these silos of religious identity immediately are breaking down to where you see there's other concerns. Religion, of course, will be one in there, but to weight it more heavily than the rest of them is a little naive. And so this goes back to, some of the same questions about sovereignty and exactly what it means. Can you be a Muslim king? And part of this chapter that you brought up was me arguing that Tipu Sultan, we shouldn't think of him as just a Muslim king. He was a Muslim who was king, but his kingdom was the kingdom of Mysore, and he was very much an Indian king. And so he thinks of his realm, his kingdom, as being the righteous realm. And this includes his Hindu subjects. And so his whole job, as he views it, is to protect his realm. And the gods, dharma, all this is leading him to rule, and he's been elected for this job. And the infidels, if we read, again, contextually within even his letters to Durrani, the Afghan king, by infidels, he's often referring to Muslims as well. So he'll include the Mughals in that. In fact, his letters to Durrani are about the Afghan army attacking the Mughals. And he also uses infidels to talk about the Nizam at certain times. So it's a much more complicated use of religious rhetoric that is not necessarily about the identity of being Muslim or Hindu, but it's about being righteous or unrighteous. And for him, since he believes himself to be divinely appointed, divinely authorized as king, his rule itself, his realm, is the righteous realm. So anyone who fights against him is immediately an infidel.
And there's this fantastic quote you have from one of his letters to the Afghan king, where he's talking about this jihad, and it's against the Mughals, and the whole idea is that the Afghan king takes Delhi and then he marches south towards Mysore to fight the British, where the British are also classed with the infidels along with the Mughals. And what's interesting is there's this line there where he tells him to bring down all the Rajputs and win over the Brahmins to this jihad, essentially. So his concept of a jihad with the Afghan king against the British and against the Mughals features very prominently and quite explicitly the social power of the Brahmins, as well as the sort of military strength of the Rajputs, and they're part of the jihad army that's coming down south. And again, you have another interesting bit where it's actually the British and the French who find it difficult to comprehend this. They seem to try and view this through a very clear prism of religion, where, Tipu equal to Muslim, the other kings equal to Hindu, and he sort of seems to shoot it down. That doesn't quite work with him.
Some of the most interesting letters are the ones that the British Governor General writes him, to where he says, like, come on, be a good Muslim and fight against the French because they've attacked Egypt and they're fighting against the Ottomans. If you're a real Muslim, you'll fight against the French, not try to ally with them, which is a very odd thing for a lot of different reasons. But you're right. Tipu Sultan doesn't take the bait, and he just basically says this is the moment where he was caught. He was supposed to be under the treaty, not making alliances against the British. They intercepted some intelligence, and Tipu's response was basically, I'm not going to respond to any of this. And I just sort of read it as him saying, I don't have to answer for my Muslim identity to you, the British. So he just sort of ignores it, goes hunting instead. And of course, this is also sort of the beginning of the end for Tipu Sultan, because not long after that, in February of 1799, the British declare war. But it is a very interesting thing when you think about sort of the totality of British history, for them to tell Tipu Sultan, to be a good Muslim. Just sort of seems like the height of hypocrisy.
It also fits into the whole Orientalist conversation that's happening then, right? Where the British are interpreting a lot of Indian religion through very textual ideas and textual sources, and they sort of can't get their head around the actual practice of these concepts in Indian society. But the fall of Tipu is a good way to segue to the other part of the book, which is focused on Krishnaraja Wodeyar III, who in your standard, Western influenced, colonial influenced, I should say, textbooks, is this puppet king. He's parked on the throne by the British, failed spectacularly at wielding power. His power seized and taken away by the British. And for 50 years, this man sort of just a puppet king or a token king sitting in his palace. He has some reputation as a patron of the arts, but in general, he's seen as a man who sort of dropped the ball again and gave Mysore up again to the British. But, and although the patronage of the arts is, of course, in South India, he's pretty well known. It was only in this book that I actually started viewing that from the concept of sovereignty. You make the argument that and I'd like you to elaborate on this, as his power and potency in the military, the physical world was depleted and dwindled substantially. He essentially in some ways shifts the narrative. He moves then to the metaphysical, the religious and the spiritual realm, because there his power in many ways is not only intact, there is scope to burnish it, there is scope to embellish it and sort of re-articulate his kingship in a completely new vocabulary. And if you could just give us a short summarization of that argument, because it's thoroughly interesting.
Him becoming king even was something that was, a very heated debate even within British circles. So if you read back to some letters after the fall of Tipu Sultan, it takes us back to the conversation we were speaking about earlier, that for the British, it needed to be biological succession. So with the death of Tipu Sultan, then it should be his sons who are the ones who become the new kings of Mysore. So you get this, debate going back and forth. Eventually, they actually decide that, not based on theoretical or theological grounds, but based on sort of fear and practicality, that Tipu Sultan's sons could not be the rulers because they would just rise up again against the British. So they installed Krishnaraja III as a child on the throne in 1799. And after he goes through the period of his childhood, he's installed on the throne. There's interpreted by the British to be financial mismanagement. So they eventually, in 1832, take away all of that administrative and military power that he had. So he actually only had administrative rule as a king for a very short period of time. But at this moment, this is when most people present this picture of him being, powerless puppet king. Basically, the complete contrast to Tipu Sultan, which is, we could talk about why we should read these two together in a little bit, but basically the contrast. But whenever I'm in Mysore and I'm, reading the archives from his life, I'm going to the Jagan Mohan Palace and looking at the murals. I go to Melkote, to Nanjangudu, and you see his statues installed into the temples. Immediately, you recognize that this story is incomplete, that he didn't have administrative power, but he had a different type of power. So returning to the conversation about theories of sovereignty and that state of exception, who gets to break the rules, one thing that I see as a major enactment of sovereignty, of the state of exception, is the ability to give tax-free land grants. So this is something that kings throughout medieval India would do. They would, give over to Brahmins, Agraharams, or Inams, whatever the term is used, but it would be a break in the normative tax rules. And when Krishnaraja Wodeyar actually had administrative power, he gave away land tax-free, where people would live off the revenue that would be going to taxes like crazy. And so this was one issue that the British took. Now, once he loses administrative control, he doesn't have the ability to do that anymore. However, that doesn't mean that he stops his patronage of these places. So he stops at this moment giving tax-free land grants, but instead he transitions now to giving cash in kind. So he'll give jewels, he'll give cash, he'll do all sorts of other things. And in fact, one of the narratives of Krishnaraja III was that he just sort of retired to his palace and didn't do much. But in fact, when you look at inscriptions, his patronage of temples actually skyrockets after he loses control. And so he gives much more frequently. He builds gopuras. He does a whole lot of things in this moment. And so when you think about what's going on within this moment, why would he turn to this sort of project of courtly production, paintings, installing images of himself, and, as I argue in the book, also finding older images and identifying them as people from his own line, that this is a way of talking about those Indian ideas of sovereignty, that it's more than just the rights of conquest, but there is this link to the divine. And specifically in Mysore case, it's to the goddess Chamundeshwari. This was a link that the British were never going to be able to have. And so there's no way the British could actually ever be in the mind of the kingdom, at least is what I argue, could never be the one who is selected by Chamundeshwari. This had to be someone there. And so he basically turns and starts making this argument that I am the king. I am the king because of my special relationship with Chamundeshwari, because I am descending from Mahavishnu. And so he blends all these ideas to kind of make an argument about what you could say devotional sovereignty, but he is the ruler over not the physical, administrative, military land, but a supernatural, or I think I call it in the book, incorporeal. So it's this unseen sovereignty that is a latent power that can be resurrected. And so I'm jumping around a lot in the book, but if you think about the murals of the Jagan Mohan Palace, which is just absolutely amazing, which they've been recently renovated and now are open to the public. So if you're ever in Mysore, you should go to the Jagan Mohan Palace and view these murals. But you have a large genealogical mural in the middle, but then you have a scene of Dasara. And so he is at the middle on his Simhasana, or his throne, and the Dasara procession is taking place all around. And at its core, Dasara, or Navratri, is a military devotional festival, that it was for the king to, about that relationship between the goddess and her empowerment of the king. So in this mural, you see that he recognizes that power is still there. It just needs to, be enacted. And he's active in letter writing campaigns through this, his entire life about having full administrative and military power restored. So instead of being just someone who sits in his palace playing games all the time, he actually is, articulating a new form of Indian sovereignty. And to be honest, I think that this makes him, a far more powerful king than anyone gives him credit for.
And it's interesting you mentioned the devotional images of himself and his wives that he placed in temples, which are also linked to other images of various ancestors, cleverly and interestingly chosen representations of various prominent ancestors. And that's sort of linked to the divine element, to those shrines, to those prominent temples. But I think you also describe another mural painting which is in some ways not really connected to the divine as much as the political on a pan-Indian scale, where you've got an Akbar, you've got an Aurangzeb, you've got Ranjit Singh, you've got Sarfoji, who's a contemporary of his, even a Tipu Sultan included. And, Krishnaraja is sort of the centerpiece of this particular painting. So he's also placing himself very consciously in a larger political tradition that is both Hindu and Muslim, and excluding the British quite openly. It's just, he's got his supposed archenemy Tipu Sultan and Hyder in it, but he doesn't have the British.
His visual rhetoric about the British could not be stronger. So in that image, that's the Dasara Darbar image from the Jagan Mohan Palace, to where the center is this genealogical lotus, but then to the sides there's images of his ministers, just like you would have in the Darbar, but there's also other rulers, and you can identify some as his allies, but it's also a historical image where you have Alamgir or Aurangzeb, you have Tipu Sultan, you have Hyder Ali, so you have all these different kings there, but what's conspicuously absent, as you bring up, are any British ministers who would have been present at his Dasara Darbar. And in fact, from the British perspective, we see paintings and lithographs of the Dasara Darbar, and they're always, the British officials, like the resident, are always, front and center. And several images, the king's sword is not present, but all the British ministers have their swords, sort of articulating that they're the real power behind the throne. But in his representation, they're not there at all. And in fact, if we go to another mural that's within the Mysore Palace fort, to Prasanna Krishna Swami temple, you actually see another representation of the Mysore Palace. But at this point, it's telling the story of the Bhagavata Purana, And you have Krishna, and again, keep in mind the name of the king is Krishnaraja, killing the usurper Kamsa, who's on the throne. But in this image, we do find the British as Kamsa's guards are in British uniform. So the rhetoric here, of course, you have to read into it a little bit, but Krishna killing this foreign power, this illegitimate power who also happens to have British guards, I think is pretty telling for the way that he viewed at least the potential potency of his sovereignty.
It's so interesting. It reminds me of the poetry and compositions of a Travancore king called Swati Tirunal, who, what you find, there was this period in the final years of his life when the British had really ensured that he wouldn't have much power, and he was just, in a similar situation. And what he ends up doing is composing a lot of praise poetry for various deities, in which they're always constantly killing, monsters and demons and all kinds of oppressors and enemies. And you keep wondering, was he trying to communicate something political also? And where you mentioned the Dasara paintings where the British are present in other courts, for example, it reminded me of one from Tanjore, where you have the king sitting in a howdah on the elephant, and you have the resident sort of squashed in with him. You can see it's a very uncomfortable scene, but the resident is there and sort of, I think, gazing out towards the viewer as though making a point that, he's very much part of this scene. Now, Krishnaraja, of course, while he was doing all this, while he was sort of making his own argument through various means, what's interesting also, he is also simultaneously lobbying the British to allow him to adopt his grandson as an heir and sort of continue the line and not let Mysore lapse. And here there's again a fascinating composition of his own, I think, from the 1860s. And this is where the famous curse of Talakad sort of makes its appearance, I think. And you talk about this in the book, and it reminded me of only recently the current adopted head of the Mysore family. He had a baby, I think, a couple of years ago. And I remember even reading an article in the BBC which sort of refers to this 17th century curse in which, because of which the Mysore kings are sort of destined not to have children every 2 generations. And it's quite interesting to see that this was actually in some ways played up by Krishnaraja in the 1860s, again to surmount or to bypass that whole question of biological succession, to make it look as though indirect succession was the norm in the Mysore family, and that biological succession wasn't such a big deal because it was ordained, or it was destined that they should have indirect succession.
I would actually, it's a goal of mine to eventually write an article or a paper on just issues of adoption within the Mysore court, because it's absolutely intriguing. And there's a little bit of evidence that this story was known before Krishnaraja wrote it into the annals of the Mysore royal family. There's Wilkes sort of tells a summary of a story that some Lingayat priest had told him, but it's never within an official court history of Mysore until we get to this point. And it's quite intriguing that he's going through the same process. And at this point, this story makes it into the official archive, to where he talks about, this moment of really, it's when the Wodeyar dynasty moves from Mysore to Srirangpatna, they're able to either overthrow or get succession from the Nayaka ruling there, sort of like as a viceroy of the Jayanagara itself. And at this point, there's this curse to where it says the Talaka will be covered in sand, the river is going to have whirlpools, and the Wodeyars can never have direct succession. So every other Wodeyar has to adopt. And it's, holds true with the current Maharaja. Yadavir was adopted, but then he had his own son. So it's an interesting narrative that seems to also play out. And this is, when you walk around Mysore and you're talking to different people about the kingdom, it's one of the first stories that you hear. So now it's so ingrained within the popular imagination. But again, the first time we see it being told on a grander scale is as he's going through the same adoption discussion. One of the interesting things about the idea of succession is, how the British took Hindu law and then kind of made it into something codified that wasn't necessarily the case. So like taking laws of Manu and making it into universal law for Hindu kings. So Krishnaraja III already had a Yuvaraja, or, an heir apparent. And this was something that was actually fun to discover as I was reading through one of the genealogical murals, one of his wives, I forget which number it was, but he had, a lot of them. I think it was like number 8 or so, had a son, Nandjaraja, and it mentioned that he was the Yuvaraja. And then I became more interested in this and went back to all of the statues of Krishnaraja that were throughout the kingdom. And there usually is a son who's always been identified as Chamaraja X, the next king that was adopted. But then as I got the pujaris to move everything in front of it, you actually find the inscription is actually Nandjaraja, this person who's really been removed from the histories of Mysore. So there's a conversation in my footnotes about this that didn't quite fit into the overall narrative. But there's this Yuvaraja who's seen as illegitimate because he's not within a child of the first 4 of the queens. So he's illegitimate. So even though he had a Yuvaraja, he still needs to get a prince or a Yuvaraja that's approved by the British. And so this is a long ongoing debate. In fact, this was international news. So if you look at the Illustrated London Times, I believe it's in 1865, they have a story about this, that he's, this kindly old gentleman who rules in Mysore. He's trying to adopt a son, and we're not gonna allow it because it's not how succession happens. Eventually, basically in the last year of his life, he's allowed to adopt, and the Mysore line continues. But it was a long, hard-fought battle in which lawyers on both sides advocate in courts about whether or not he should be able to adopt a son and the line continue.
And this is where he plays up the story about the curse.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's because that was part of, the doctrine of Dalhousie, is that, if you didn't have direct succession and other things, then the British could annex the court. But the British would never interfere if things could be proven as like legitimate religious reasons. And so my argument is that this curse of Talakad was a religious curse. And so at this moment, it became like not an issue of just sort of human legal practice, but that it was divine intervention. Therefore, the British couldn't intervene in this sort of religious matter.
And therefore, adoption was the norm, not necessarily the aberration as the British thought it.
Right.
For me, that was one of the most fascinating parts of the book. In fact, you have all kinds of fascinating details in the footnotes, since you mentioned the footnotes. I was, for example, surprised that Tipu Sultan constructed his famous tiger throne and never actually sat on it, because he thought he would only sit on it after he defeated the British. And the British, to make their own sort of narrative point, they dismantled the throne when they loot the palace afterwards. And I was wondering why it was in the footnote, because it was such an interesting detail to have. Now, I'll go back to something I asked you earlier, and I'd like you to sort of explain why you think Krishnaraja III and Tipu Sultan, who in most ordinary, everyday, newspaper narratives, public narratives, Twitter narratives, these are people who are opposites of each other. Some say Tipu Sultan was this valiant fighter, Krishnaraja was a wuss. Some say, Krishnaraja was the great patron of arts, Tipu Sultan was a tyrant and a jihadist sort of, freak. And these are the conversations that tend to happen a lot in the public domain. Whereas you have sort of put them together in one book and showed that they actually had a lot in common. Both dealt with issues of biological succession. Tipu Sultan, for example, because, his father had just only recently seized power and it wasn't a long royal line. Both negotiated various problems with the British and both connected their kingship not just to, Hindu and Islamic traditions of religion, but also local, very Karnataka-based, very local kinds of forms of legitimization. And if you can just give us your perspective as a closing note, as to why you think, you wanted to put them both in a book and what the larger argument you were trying to make.
Yeah, thanks. And this is part of, what you articulate, exactly why I wound up putting them in the same book, is that they are viewed as diametrically opposed royal figures. No matter how they're framed, it's always framed as complete opposites. Hindu, Muslim, powerful warrior, puppet king, patron of the arts, someone who destroys temples. And so it's always this, adversarial relationship. And, that's, if you look just very superficially, you can see where people would make that argument. But as you dive deeper into the things that they did as kings, the way that they patronize different temples, their building projects, their devotional poetry, their histories that they write, all of these things actually follow very similar trajectories. In the way that they use all of these different media, whether it's paintings, letters, treatises, they're articulating what it means to be a sovereign king in very similar ways. And this happens a little differently when it's executed for Tipu Sultan because he does have administrative and military power. So the way that he does it is a little more obvious. It's a little more explicit. And it's something that continues on in his lasting legacy throughout the world, is that he was, a great fighter, very like a strong person, no matter how you view what he does, that he was this powerful military leader. And then when you look at Krishnaraja III, when he goes to actually exercise his sovereignty, he doesn't have that ability. So it becomes a little more implicit what his power was, but it was a power to really frame how Indian kings can have a sovereign place. And one thing that we haven't talked about as part of that articulation was the articulation of an identity as an Indian and eventually as a Hindu toward the end of it. It's a term he starts to use more and more frequently. And as such, I actually think that the rhetoric coming out of his court actually provide a lot of the basis and the foundations for the Indian independence movement. So while some people frame Tipu Sultan as a great freedom fighter, it's actually, in my opinion, Krishna Raja III who lays a lot of the groundwork of thinking of India as its own unit that can be combined under one idea of sovereignty. And so in this way, I think that there is a lasting legacy of Krishna Raja III that moves into the Indian independence movement and the thought of Indian sovereignty within the modern world.
And this is also where he has, he builds these connections with all these temples up north as well. There's a chapter on this pilgrim, for example, who goes out and then brings Ganga water for him. But yeah, I won't go into that for now, but just one final question on sources as well as, your negotiation of Kannada. And this very amusing almost anecdote that you have of your own, discussion with the late Maharaja of Mysore, who passed away, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. And you talk about how you approached him to get access to some of this material in Kannada in the palace archives. And he said, why are you looking at this? Why don't you go look at the British sources? And you sort of express your amazement and how you were a little startled by that response. Just, tell us about how you negotiated, how you got to this juncture that you wanted to get into this, and how you negotiated these strange little, pieces of advice you were getting. I don't know how fluently you speak Kannada, probably very fluently, but, what brought you to Karnataka to begin with, and, some of these other questions of, how you went about organizing all this research.
Yeah, so I came to Karnataka. I actually always planned on doing research in North India, but I came to Mysore because one of my lasting academic interests is in the Hindu goddess. And so I came to sort of on vacation, actually, to visit Chamundi Hill and Chamundeshwari. And when I got there, of course, Mysore's weather, I was in Jaipur previously. Mysore's weather was a lot more enjoyable in the summer. And as I walked around the Mysore Palace, I realized that, I didn't know much about the Wodeyar kingdom, but something interesting had been going on there. And so I, at that point, shifted to South India and luckily was able to get a Kannada language fellowship through the American Institute of Indian Studies and spend 1 year in Mysore learning Kannada and then a second year in Mysore contiguously doing my research. And again, most of it started actually up on Chamundi Hill at the Chamundeshwari temples, working with the pujaris and the dikshitas up there. But I found myself more and more being pulled down the hill toward the palace because the story of Chamundeshwari is incomplete without the story of the Wodeyars. Their rise goes hand in hand with one another. And for the most part, I worked with archives through the state because it was very hard to get a meeting with the late Maharaja. And in fact, it's been harder even to get a meeting with the new Maharaja. But so when I finally was able to meet with him, it was, unfortunately, he would die a few months later. But it was right before Dasara started in 2013. And I was thrilled to be able to meet with him and share my research. And, still to this day, I'm extremely thankful that he took, hours to sit with me and go through my research. And we read through line by line, and he gave, comments and critiques, and it was actually a very enjoyable experience. But like you said, toward the end of it, my main goal had been to see the actual manuscripts from some of the published works that I had read. And so the goal was, proving my ability to research in Kannada, and then hopefully at that point I would meet his threshold and would get access. And then at this moment is when he denied access, but also told me that, to understand Indian kingship, I really should be looking at James Todd's book on the Rajputs. And, this was to me a very startling idea. I assumed that, I was interested in his family and the manuscripts that had been produced by the Wodeyar line, that this would be something that he'd be interested in. But in many ways, if I don't have that conversation, and if he doesn't point me toward the North Indian material that was read through a British colonial administrator, this book never happens. Because it was upon reflecting on that I realized that, the rhetoric that comes out of this court completely shapes the Wodeyar kingdom moving forward. It shapes how they're presenting themselves. And it also helped me understand how a king or a Maharaja who's part of a independent India secular republic also can still be a Maharaja. That it's the same process of defining the boundaries of one's sovereignty. And his sovereignty was very different than Tipu, very different than Krishnaraja. His sovereignty was over these archives. And it was up to him to decide who has access, who doesn't. And so this really, in many ways, was a catalyst to think about the material in new ways, and think about how, when kings make decisions, when kings present themselves in a certain way, this is part of the enactment, the articulation, and the definition of boundaries of their own sovereignty.
That's a fascinating note to end on, especially because devotional sovereignty, as Krishnaraja saw it, at least seems to have worked clearly, because you also have this line where I think when this last Maharaja passes away and the ambulance driver is bringing back his body, the driver actually says, "I'm bringing back a god," which means that even in the 21st century, somehow that idea of sovereignty continues in a different form and continues to animate people's minds and imaginations. Thank you, Caleb, and I look forward to whatever you're working on next, because if this is anything to go by, I'm sure it will be another splendid piece of work.
Well, thank you, Manu. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Caleb, Manu, thank you so much for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure to host you both on BIC Talks. I hope to have you both again on various occasions. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app, and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week. And do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.